I'm a freak when it comes to this stuff. What do you think is going on up there?
I mean, same thing that's going on all over the place when it comes to military secrets, which is stuff that you want to know about, very few people know about, and every now and then a journalist gets a hint at it, right?
Unbelievable World War II disappearances JR never covered. The history of the Second World War is traditionally understood as an era of absolute accountability, where the industrial scale of conflict required rigorous documentation from tracking of every shell to the census of every casualty. However, within the gaps of this meticulous record-keeping exist 11 specific instances where the logistical, mechanical, and human apparatus of war simply ceased to function, leaving behind voids that defy conventional explanation. These events represent more than mere tactical losses. They're ontological ruptures where individuals and massive machines vanished from the physical world, often in environments that should have precluded such absolute disappearance. The L-8 Ghost Blimp and the San Francisco Coastal Patrol. On the morning of August 16, 1942, as the Second World War pressed uneasily against America's western shoreline, a U.S. Navy airship lifted quietly in the pale California sky. The aircraft was L-8, a non-rigid blimp assigned to Airship Patrol Squadron 32, and its mission was unremarkable by every official measure. A routine anti-submarine sweep along a familiar coastal corridor that traced the Farallon Islands, curved past Point Reyes, and followed the rugged outline of Montera. Yet by nightfall, the L-8 would become the center of one of the strangest aviation mysteries in American military history. The blimp departed from Treasure Island at precisely 6:03 a.m., carrying a crew of 2. Lieutenant Ernest DeWitt Cody, 27 years old, served as aircraft commander. His co-pilot was Ensign Charles Adams, 35, flying his first mission as a commissioned officer. While Adams was new to the rank, neither man was inexperienced. Both had logged significant flight hours, and the records show no signs of recklessness or incompetence. Still, the asymmetry of rank and experience would later invite speculation about cockpit dynamics in the moments leading up to the disaster. For nearly 2 hours, the patrol unfolded exactly as planned. The L-8 cruised low over the Pacific, scanning the waters for enemy submarines, rumored to be operating alarmingly close to the American coast. At 7:50 a.m., the airship transmitted what would become its final radio message. "Am investigating suspicious oil slick. Stand by." It was a routine report, the kind sent countless times during coastal patrols, and it raised no immediate concern. The radio fell silent after that, but silence alone was not unusual during visual investigation runs. What followed, however, defied every expectation of normal flight behavior. Over the next several hours, the L-8 was spotted repeatedly by civilians and military personnel alike. A Liberty ship observed the blimp circling offshore. Fishermen saw it drifting steadily, engines quiet, but the envelope still fully inflated. At no point did the ship appear to be in distress. It did not signal for help, it did not trail smoke or debris. It simply wandered. By late morning, the blimp had crossed inland. Witnesses along the California coastline reported a strange sight. The L-8 gliding silently overhead, sagging slightly, unguided, as though abandoned. Eventually, gravity and geography intervened. The airship drifted toward Ocean Beach, scraped against a hillside near the Lake Merced golf course, and dislodged a depth charge in the process. The charge did not detonate. The blimp continued onward, finally settling on Bellevue Avenue in Daly City, where it came to rest against buildings and power lines, like a lost animal finally laying down. When first responders and local police reached the gondola, they were met with a scene that bordered on the impossible. The crew compartment was empty. The door was latched open, a configuration that violated standard flight protocol and should never occur during an active patrol. Inside, however, nearly everything remained undisturbed. 3 parachutes were still stowed. The life raft was untouched. Emergency radio equipment had not been deployed, and most settling of all, only 2 of the 3 required life jackets were present. If the regulations had been followed, at least 1 man would have exited the aircraft without flotation over open water. The physical condition of the gondola made accidental ejection extraordinarily unlikely. The railing was intact. There were no signs of a struggle, no torn fittings, no structural damage consistent with a fall. The notion that both men had tumbled out simultaneously strained credulity. Even more puzzling was the Blimp's behavior after its disappearance. Mathematically modeling of the L8's buoyancy indicated that the removal of 2 adult men, roughly 350 to 400 pounds combined, should have caused a rapid and noticeable climb. Instead, witnesses described a slow, almost lethargic descent. In simplified terms, the airship's equilibrium depended on the lift generated by its helium envelope, balancing the combined weight of the craft and its crew. Removing the crew weight should have shifted that balance upward. The fact that it did not suggests that something else changed as well. Investigators later theorized that a slow leak or deliberate venting of helium occurred after the crew left the gondola. Whether this was intentional or incidental remains unknown, but it implies agency, sequence, and time, elements that complicate any simple explanation. In the tense atmosphere of 1942, more sensational theories flourished. Rumors circulated that the crew had been captured by a Japanese submarine, particularly after reports emerged of enemy fire near the Golden Gate Bridge earlier that year. Yet no physical evidence supported this scenario. No hostile vessel was confirmed in the vicinity. No debris, signals, or subsequent intelligence ever pointed to foreign involvement. The Pacific swallowed its secrets, but it did not give up proof. The Navy conducted an extensive investigation, interviewing witnesses, analyzing the airship's mechanics, and reconstructing the patrol timeline. Still, no definitive conclusion emerged. The official findings acknowledged the facts, but stopped short of explanation. Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams were never found. Their disappearance occurred in daylight within sight of the American mainland, amid one of the most heavily monitored stretches of water on the west coast. In a final irony, the L8 itself survived. After repairs, the gondola was returned to service. Its mission history quietly extended as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Today, it resides in the National Naval Aviation Museum, a preserved artifact of wartime vigilance. Visitors can stand before it, peer into its narrow interior, and imagine the ordinary patrol that became anything but ordinary. The L8 remains a mute witness to a vanishing act executed without noise, struggle, or clear motive. 2 men stepped into the sky and did not return, leaving behind a machine that flew on without them, drifting until the Earth itself intervened. In the annals of aviation history, few mysteries are so clean, so public, and so profoundly unresolved. The undersea cruiser Surcouf and the collision paradox. The French submarine Surcouf was never meant to be subtle. Conceived in the uneasy aftermath of the First World War, it was a naval contradiction. Given steel and ballast, a submarine designed not merely to evade detection, but to dominate the surface. Classified as a cruiser submarine, Surcouf emerged from the interwar period as a deliberate attempt to sidestep the tonnage limitations imposed by the Washington Naval Treaty. Where other navies trimmed displacement and armament to comply with international restraint, France chose legal ingenuity. The result was a vessel so heavily armed, so unusually equipped, that it stood apart even among experimental warships. Launched in 1929, Surcouf immediately claimed the title of the largest submarine in the world, a distinction it would hold for 15 years until the Japanese unveiled the I-400 class in the final phase of the Second World War. Measuring 110 meters in length and displacing over 4,300 tons when submerged, was closer in scale to a surface cruiser than to the stealth-focused submarines that would later define undersea warfare. Its most striking feature was its twin 203mm over 8-inch naval guns housed in pressurized turret forward of the conning tower. These were battleship-caliber weapons by submarine standards, intended to allow Surcouf to engage enemy merchant ships or even light cruisers on the surface. Beyond its guns, the submarine's design bordered on the extravagant. A watertight hangar concealed a Besson MB-411 reconnaissance seaplane, complete with folding wings, which could be assembled and launched to extend the submarine's scouting range. Few submarines before or since carried aircraft as an integral part of their mission profile. Even more unsettling was the inclusion of a dedicated detonation compartment, reportedly capable of holding up to 40 prisoners. Surcouf was not merely a hunter. It was envisioned as a roaming sea fortress, capable of capture, intimidation, and sustained independent operations far from friendly ports. The ambition came at a cost. The vessel was mechanically complex, slow to dive, and difficult to operate in rough seas. Its maximum safe diving depth, approximately 80 meters, was shallow compared to later wartime submarines, making it vulnerable once detected. Still, in the strategic imagination of the French Navy, Surcouf represented power projection beneath the waves, a symbol of national prestige as much as military utility. That symbolism became politically explosive in June of 1940, when Germany invaded France and the nation collapsed with stunning speed. As the French government sought an armistice, Surcouf made its way to Plymouth, England, joining other French warships seeking refuge in British ports. What followed would permanently stain the submarine's operational history. On July 3, 1940, the British initiated Operation Catapult, a preemptive strike aimed at preventing the French fleet from falling into Axis hands. The operation involved ultimata, seizures, and in some cases, open violence. The boarding of Surcouf was among the most brutal episodes. British forces attempting to seize control of the submarine, encountering resistance from its crew. The confrontation escalated rapidly. 3 British officers were killed, along with 1 French sailor. Blood was spilled in cramped compartments, and trust between allies evaporated in an instant. Although Surcouf was eventually brought under Free French control, the incident left deep scars. Relations between the crew and the British Admiralty were poisoned by suspicion, resentment, and mutual fear. The submarine continued to serve, but it did so under a cloud of political tension that would never fully lift. This history of mistrust forms an essential context for what happens next. On the night of February 18, 1942, Surcouf vanished while transiting the Caribbean en route to the Panama Canal. Aboard were between 118 and 130 men, depending on the source, including crew and additional personnel. No distress signal was received. No confirmed wreckage was ever recovered. The official explanation emerged quickly, neat, and devastating in its simplicity: collision. According to American records, the U.S. freighter SS Thompson Likes reported striking a submerged object during a nighttime passage. The impact scraped along the freighter's keel, and shortly afterward, crew members claimed to hear cries for help in the water. Believing they had collided with an enemy German U-boat, the freighter did not stop. The war left little room for hesitation. The object was logged, the ship continued, and the sea closed over whatever had been struck. In a later reconstruction, that object was identified as Surcouf. Yet the collision narrative has never fully satisfied historians. No debris field was found. No oil slick was confirmed. The coordinates associated with the incident, roughly 10 degrees 40 minutes north and 79 degrees 30 minutes west, yielded nothing despite subsequent searches. For a vessel of Surcouf's size and mass, the absence of physical evidence is conspicuous. A submarine of over 4,000 tons does not simply vanish without a trace. Alternative theories began circulating almost immediately. Some suggest that the collision story functioned as a convenient cover for a case of friendly fire. One persistent claim alleges that Surcouf was mistakenly attacked by U.S. aircraft, possibly from the 3rd Bombardment Squadron operating out of Panama, misidentifying the submarine as hostile. Others propose sabotage, rumors circulated that British authorities, wary of the submarine's loyalty and alarmed by its size and armament, had taken steps to ensure it would never fall into Vichy or Axis hands. According to these accounts, Surcouf may have been secretly mined during a stopover in Bermuda. These suspicions were reinforced by disturbing anecdotes from the period. French sailors reportedly recalled warnings from British liaison officers in Halifax, who allegedly told them they were shaking hands with dead men if they continued to serve aboard the vessel. Whether apocryphal or not, such statements reflect the atmosphere of paranoia and political fragility surrounding the submarine. Surcouf was not merely a weapon, it was a liability, a floating symbol of divided loyalties in a war that tolerated little ambiguity. Today, the fate of Surcouf remains unresolved. No wreck has been definitively identified. No final report has closed the case beyond administrative necessity. All 130 men aboard are listed as lost at sea, the submarine reduced to coordinates and conjecture. In the historical record, Surcouf persists as a ghost of the Caribbean, a warship that embodied excess, innovation, and mistrust in equal measure. Whether destroyed by a tragic accident or quietly eliminated by allies who no longer trusted it, Surcouf represents the darker underside of coalition warfare. It was a machine too large, too strange, and too politically inconvenient to fit neatly into the moral narratives of the Second World War. Its disappearance, like its design, resists simplification, leaving behind only unanswered questions and the enduring sense that something enormous slipped beneath the surface and was never meant to resurface again. The B-24D, Lady Be Good, a desert preservation. In the annals of aviation disasters, few stories combine such clinical precision and such human devastation as the case of the Lady Be Good. It's unique not because of explosive failure or violent destruction, but because of what survived. The aircraft endured almost perfectly. The crew did not. What remains is a case study in navigational error, environmental illusion, and the merciless logic of geography. The Lady Be Good was a brand new B-24D Liberator, fresh from America's factories and newly assigned to the 376th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Force. On April 4, 1943, it lifted off from Surcouf Field near Benghazi, Libya, as part of a long-range bombing mission against Naples, Italy. For the 9 men aboard, this was their first combat sortie. The aircraft had never seen enemy fire. The crew had never flown into war. By every measure, it was an initiation flight. Conditions deteriorated almost immediately. Heavy sandstorms rolled across North Africa, disrupting navigation and obscuring visibility. One by one, aircraft in the formation aborted and turned back toward Libya. The Lady Be Good, however, pressed on alone, separated from the group and flying blind through darkness and blowing sand. By the time the crew reached the Italian coastline, weather and visibility were so poor that bombing was impossible. No ordnance was dropped. With fuel already marginal after the long outbound leg, the decision was made to turn south and return to base. It was here, in the black hours after midnight, that the mission crossed from danger into inevitability. At 12:12 a.m., the pilot, Lieutenant William Hatton, requested a radio bearing to help guide the aircraft home. The high-frequency direction-finding station at Bernina responded with a bearing of 330 degrees. The transmission was accurate. The interpretation was fatal. The navigator assumed they were still north of the Libyan coast over the Mediterranean Sea, and that the bearing pointed them safely toward land and Surcouf Field. In reality, the aircraft had already overflown the base, unseen in darkness and storm, and was now heading south, deeper into the Sahara Desert. Every mile flown after that moment carried them farther from water, fuel, and rescue. At approximately 2 a.m., with fuel exhausted, the order to bail out was given. The crew believed they were jumping into the sea. Nighttime conditions over the desert can produce a visual illusion in which sand reflects moonlight like water, flattening depth perception and erasing landmarks. The Sahara had become an ocean in the mind. One by one, the men parachuted into a place they were not equipped to survive. Unmanned, the Lady Be Good did not immediately fall. With engines sputtering out and systems still functional, it continued on autopilot for another 16 miles. Then, in one of the most extraordinary footnotes in aviation history, the aircraft performed a near-perfect belly landing in the Calancio Sand Sea. There was no fire, no explosion. The fuselage settled into the dunes as gentle as a practice landing, wings intact, cockpit undisturbed. It was an aircraft that looked ready to fly again, frozen in time. 8 of the 9 crewmen survived the jump and regrouped in the desert. The 9th, Sergeant John Varovka, was killed on impact. The survivors faced an impossible calculation. They had 1 canteen of water between them. They had no accurate sense of location. They believed the sea and safety lay to the north. They began to walk. For 8 days, the men trekked northward across the desert, covering roughly 100 miles. The sun burnt relentlessly during the day. The cold bit sharply at night. Water ran out quickly. Boots disintegrated. Strength faded. Diaries later recovered from the body of co-pilot Robert Toner recorded the slow collapse of the group, entries growing shorter and more fragmented as dehydration and exhaustion took hold. The writer speaks not of panic, but of discipline, of men doing what training and reason told them was correct. They were wrong by direction, not by effort. Had the crew walked south instead of north, they would have reached the aircraft wreckage within days. Inside the Lady Be Good were working radios, food rations, medical supplies, and drinkable water. The aircraft's emergency equipment remained untouched, waiting in silence. The desert placed salvation behind them and death ahead, and the crew never knew. The Lady Be Good itself vanished completely. No search aircraft spotted it. No patrol crossed its path. For 16 years, it remained where it landed, preserved by arid air and drifting sand. In 1958, a British oil exploration team stumbled upon the aircraft by accident. What they found defied belief. The plane was almost immaculate. Paper maps lay where they had been left. Machine guns were still mounted. Personal effects sat undisturbed. It was as though the crew had simply stepped out moments earlier. The discovery triggered renewed searches for the men. In 1960, the remains of 5 crew members were found approximately 80 miles north of the wreck. Their positions confirmed the direction of their fatal march. Additional remains were located later, scattered along the same trajectory. The desert had not hidden them. It had waited. The Lady Be Good became a case study in what investigators later described as reciprocal error in navigation. The crew made a reasonable assumption based on flawed information, then compounded it by acting logically within that assumption. Darkness made desert look like sea. A correct bearing became incorrect guidance when applied to the wrong position. Each decision followed cleanly from the last, forming a chain that led away from survival with mathematical certainty. In the years that followed, parts of the Lady Be Good were salvaged and installed in other B-24s operating in the region. Several of those aircrafts later suffered unexplained mechanical failures. Whether coincidence, poor maintenance, or wartime superstition, the stories fueled a lingering reputation for the plane as cursed. The Lady became an object of quiet dread, spoken of in crew rooms and maintenance hangars with a mixture of reverence and unease. Yet the true horror of the Lady Be Good lies not in superstition, but in clarity. The aircraft did exactly what it was built to do. The men did what they believed was right. The desert simply enforced the consequences. No enemy fire, no catastrophic failure, no single moment of drama sealed their fate. Only distance, direction, and the refusal of the environment to forgive error. The Lady Be Good remains one of the most haunting artifacts of the Second World War, an aircraft preserved by indifference, a crew erased by certainty. Together they form a silent equation. When navigation fails, survival becomes a matter of not courage or endurance, but of geography. The I-52, the submerged gold of the Yanagi missions. The Japanese submarine I-52 never vanished by chance. Its fate not the product of miscalculation, weather, or mechanical failure, but of information, acquired quietly, analyzed patiently, and acted upon with lethal precision. Among the many losses of the Second World War, the destruction of the I-52 stands apart as a demonstration of how warfare had shifted from visible confrontation to invisible dominance. The submarine was doomed long before it ever encountered an American aircraft. Its destruction written not in steel or explosives, but in intercepted signals and decrypted code books. The I-52 was a C-3 type cargo submarine, one of the largest and most ambitious transport submarines ever constructed by Imperial Japan. It belonged to the Yanagi Exchange Program, a clandestine logistical effort designed to move strategic materials, technology, and personnel between Japan and Nazi Germany, despite Allied control of the seas. Surface shipping between the Axis powers had become nearly impossible by 1943. Submarines were the last viable artery, slow and perilous, but capable of slipping through blockades that strangled conventional supply routes. In April 1944, I-52 departed from Kuri Naval Base on what would be its final voyage. Its destination was Lorient, a heavily fortified German U-boat base on the French Atlantic coast. The submarine's cargo made it one of the most viable single vessels afloat during the war. Deep within its hull were 146 gold bars, weighing approximately 2.2 metric tons, intended as payment to Germany for advanced optical systems, radar components, and cutting-edge jet engine research. It was not merely wealth, but technological leverage, compressed into a steel cylinder beneath the waves. The gold was only part of this manifest. The submarine also carried vast quantities of strategic raw materials essential to the German war effort: tungsten and molybdenum for hardened steel alloys, tin for manufacturing, quinine for tropical medicine, and nearly 3 tons of opium for pharmaceutical use. In total, the cargo represented a desperate attempt by two embattled empires to sustain one another as Allied pressures closed in from every direction. The I-52 was not a warship in the traditional sense. It was a courier of survival. What the crew did not know was that the mission had already been compromised. Allied cryptanalysts had broken the Japanese purple diplomatic cipher, granting access to high-level communications between Tokyo and its Axis partners. Through this intelligence, the Allies learned not only that the I-52 was en route to Europe, but its exact schedule, route, and even the coordinates of a planned mid-Atlantic rendezvous with a German U-boat. The submarine was being tracked on paper long before it was tracked in the water. Armed with this intelligence, the U.S. Navy assembled a hunter-killer task group centered around the escort carrier USS Bogue. Escort carriers were the quiet predators of the Atlantic War, small compared to fleet carriers, but perfectly suited to anti-submarine operations. Their aircraft, operating in conjunction with destroyer escorts, could control vast expanses of ocean, guided not by chance encounters, but by precise intelligence. On the night of June 23, 1944, the trap closed. As I-52 approached the rendezvous point, unaware that it was sailing into an invisible crosshair, aircraft from Bogue took to the sky. Among them was a Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bomber, piloted by Lieutenant Commander Jesse Taylor. The aircraft carried tools that represented the cutting edge of anti-submarine warfare: newly developed sonobuoys capable of detecting underwater sounds, and a Mark 24 Fido acoustic homing torpedo designed to follow the noise of a submarine's propellers. The Avenger located I-52 in darkness, guided by sonobuoy data and radio coordination. The submarine may have surfaced briefly, or may have been running shallow to conserve battery power. In either case, it was detected. Taylor released the acoustic torpedo, which entered the water and began its patient search. There was no dramatic exchange of fire, no evasive maneuver that could have saved the Japanese vessel. The torpedo found its target. Moments later, I-52 disappeared beneath the Atlantic, taking its cargo, its secrets, and its crew with it. The submarine sank nearly 3 miles to a depth of approximately 17,000 feet. At such depth, pressure exceeds 7,500 pounds per square inch. No human technology of the era, or for decades afterward, could hope to reach it. Officially, I-52 was simply listed as sunk. Unofficially, it became legend. Stories of Japanese gold, resting untouched on the ocean floor, circulated for decades, blending historical fact with the allure of unreachable treasure. The wreck remained undiscovered until 1995, when Paul Tidwell, a former U.S. Navy officer turned deep-sea researcher, led an expedition using advanced sonar and remotely operated vehicles. After years of searching, Tidwell located the I-52, sitting upright on the seabed, remarkably intact despite the crushing depth. The submarine appeared almost serene, as though placed gently rather than destroyed. Its discovery confirmed long-suspected details of the sinking and reignited interest in its extraordinary cargo. Subsequent dives recovered small artifacts from the wreck site, including pieces of metal and a limited amount of opium, but the gold remained inside the pressured hull. Legal, ethical, and diplomatic complications quickly overtook any notion of recovery. The site was recognized as a maritime grave. 99 Japanese soldiers had died aboard I-52, along with several German technicians who were in the process of transferring during the planned rendezvous. The gold, valuable as it was, became secondary to the reality of human loss sealed beneath thousands of meters of water. More than a story of sunken treasure, the destruction of I-52 illustrates a decisive shift in how war was fought and won. No American ship ever stumbled upon the submarine by chance. No patrol simply happened to cross its path. The engagement was the final act of a process that began months earlier, in quiet rooms filled with intercepted messages and careful analysis. The submarine's destruction was not a tactical victory, but an informational one. In this sense, I-52 never truly disappeared. It was erased. Its course, cargo, and fate were known in advance by enemies who never revealed their hand. The torpedo that struck it was merely the physical punctuation at the end of a sentence written in code. By the time the crew felt the impact, the outcome had already been decided. Today, I-52 rests in permanent darkness, its gold untouched, its hull sealed by pressure and time. It is a monument to the limits of secrecy in modern warfare, and to the uncomfortable truth that by 1944, the most dangerous battles were no longer fought with guns alone. They were fought with information. Joe also talked about UFO discoveries, but never about the never-found Flight 19. Flight 19, the genesis of the triangle Mythos. While the Lady Be Good vanished into a literal desert of sand and heat, Flight 19 disappeared into a different kind of emptiness, a navigational void later mythologized as the Bermuda Triangle. What distinguished the Flight 19 incident is not mystery layered upon mystery, but how an ordinary training exercise unraveled into one of the most enduring legends in aviation history through a sequence of small human errors amplified by hierarchy, weather, and time. On the afternoon of December 5, 1945, barely 3 months after the official end of World War II, 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers lifted off from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. Their mission was designated Navigation Problem Number 1, a routine overwater training exercise flown countless times before. The plan was simple: fly east to a bombing range near the Hens and Chickens Shoals, drop practice ordnance, turn north, then return west to Florida. The aircraft were rugged, reliable, and battle-tested. The pilots were trained. Nothing about the mission suggested danger. The flight leader was Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor, a combat veteran with more than 2,500 flight hours. Taylor had flown extensively in the Pacific Theater, but he was new to the Florida region and unfamiliar with the subtle geography of the Bahamas and Keys. This distinction mattered more than anyone realized at the time. Over featureless water, navigation depended on dead reckoning, compass accuracy, and environmental awareness. Removing one of these elements, and confusion could spread quickly. Approximately 90 minutes into the flight, Taylor transmitted a troubling message. His compass, he reported, was malfunctioning. He believed the squadron was flying over the Florida Keys, but the geography below did not match his expectations. The statement immediately concerned the other pilots. Based on their own observations and instruments, they believed they were actually over the northern Bahamas, east of Florida, not south. The difference was critical. If Taylor was wrong, every corrective decision based on that assumption would carry them farther from safety. Radio transcripts reveal that several pilots attempted to challenge Taylor's assessment. One suggested flying west immediately. Another proposed turning north to intersect the mainland. Yet naval aviation culture placed heavy emphasis on formation discipline. Taylor was the designated leader, and his authority carried weight. Despite mounting uncertainty, the squadron continued to follow his headings. What later investigators would call follow the leader syndrome had begun to assert itself. As the afternoon progressed, Taylor's confusion deepened. Convinced he was over the Keys, he reasoned that flying northeast would take the squadron back toward Florida. In reality, that course carried them farther into the open Atlantic. Requests for radar assistance were made, but no immediate support was available. Weather conditions deteriorated as dusk approached. Visibility dropped. Seas below grew rough. The Avengers, designed for carrier operations, were not well suited for extended ditching scenarios in heavy surf. By early morning, fuel became the dominant concern. The TBM Avenger was a powerful aircraft, but its range was finite. Taylor acknowledged that fuel was running low and that a ditching might soon be unavoidable. His final transmission suggests a grim resignation rather than panic. At approximately 6:20 p.m., fragmented radio messages faded into static. Flight 19 was never heard from again. What transformed the incident from tragedy into legend was what happened next. Within minutes of Flight 19 being declared overdue, the Navy launched a massive search and rescue operation. Among the first aircraft dispatched was a PBM-5 Mariner flying boat, a large patrol aircraft carrying 13 men. The Mariner had its own reputation. Nicknamed the Flying Gas Tank, it was known to be vulnerable to fuel vapor explosions. Less than a half an hour after takeoff, the Mariner vanished. A nearby tanker crew reported seeing a sudden fireball on the horizon, consistent with an airborne explosion. No distress call was received. No wreckage was conclusively identified. 13 more men were added to the toll. In a single evening, 6 aircraft and 27 lives had disappeared. Despite an extensive search covering more than 300,000 miles over 5 days, the Navy found nothing. No floating debris, no oil slicks, no bodies. The Atlantic, stirred by wind and current, offered no trace. The Avengers, heavy with engines and dense airframes, were known to sink rapidly once waterlogged. Any evidence would have descended quickly in deep water beyond recovery. The official investigation initially placed primary responsibility on Lieutenant Taylor, citing navigational error and poor decision-making. This conclusion did not sit well with his family. Taylor's mother formally petitioned the Navy, arguing that mechanical issues, weather, and systemic failures contributed to the loss. Eventually, the cause was amended from pilot error to unknown, an unusual reversal that acknowledged uncertainty without resolving it. From a probabilistic standpoint, the simultaneous failure of 5 aircraft due to mechanical malfunction is unlikely. The more plausible explanation lies in collective human behavior under stress. Taylor's initial compass issues, whether real or perceived, created a cognitive anchor. Once he accepted the premise that he was over the Keys, Every contradictory data point was filtered through that belief. Despite processing functioning instruments deferred to authority, their individual corrections never translated into collective action. This dynamic is well documented in aviation psychology. In ambiguous situations, especially with hierarchical structures, groups often default to centralized decision-making, even when distributed information suggests an alternative. Flight 19 distributes how discipline, normally a safeguard, can become a liability when the leader is wrong and the environment offers no immediate feedback. The disappearance quickly escaped the bounds of technical investigation and entered a popular culture. Writers and commentators seized upon the lack of wreckage and the coincidence of the lost rescue plane to construct narratives of supernatural interference. The term Bermuda Triangle gained traction in the decades that followed, retroactively absorbing Flight 19 into a mythology of vanishing ships and planes. Yet, stripped of embellishment, the incident reveals no anomaly of physics or geography. The Atlantic did not swallow the aircraft mysteriously. Fuel exhaustion over rough seas, followed by nighttime ditching, would have led to rapid sinking. Search aircraft of the era were limited in endurance and detection capability. Ocean currents dispersed surface evidence quickly. What appears inexplicable in hindsight aligns closely with known operational realities of mid-20th century naval aviation. Flight 19 was not lost in a place without rules. It was lost in a space where rules were misapplied, assumptions went unchallenged, and time ran out. Like the Lady Be Good, the tragedy hinged on navigation, perception, and the quiet tyranny of being slightly wrong for too long. The difference is that Flight 19 left no physical artifact behind, no preserved wreck, no diary entries, only radio transmissions fading into silence. In that absence, myth flourished. But beneath the legend lies a familiar truth. Aviation disasters are rarely the result of a single catastrophic failure. More often, they emerge from a chain of ordinary decisions made under imperfect conditions. Flight 19 vanished not into the supernatural, but into the unforgiving arithmetic of distance, fuel, and human trust. Heinrich Müller, the architect of the void. Heinrich Müller occupies a singular and unsettling position in the history of the Third Reich. He is the highest-ranking Nazi official to vanish at the end of the war without a confirmed death, capture, or trial. Unlike figures whose fates were sealed in bunkers, gallows, or courtrooms, Müller simply disappears from the historical record. No remains, no photographs of a corpse, no verified witness to a final moment. For a regime obsessed with documentation, his absence is profound. Known colloquially as Gestapo Müller to distinguish him from the countless other Müllers in Germany, Heinrich Müller was not a charismatic ideologue or a public symbol of Nazism. He was something more dangerous, a professional bureaucrat of repression. Born in 1900, Müller rose through the ranks of the Bavarian police before being absorbed into the Nazi security apparatus. Unlike Heinrich Himmler, whose mystical obsessions shaped the SS, or Reinhard Heydrich, whose ambition and cruelty were theatrical, Müller was methodical. He believed in procedure, he believed in files, he believed in efficiency. This disposition made him indispensable. As chief of the Gestapo, Müller oversaw the machinery of internal terror, surveillance, interrogations, deportations, and executions. He attended the Wannsee Conference in January 1942, where the administrative framework for the final solution was formalized. Müller did not need to advocate genocide. By that point, genocide was already his department's daily work. His presence at Wannsee symbolized something colder than fanaticism, the normalization of mass murder through paperwork. Contemporaries describe Müller as emotionally opaque. He did not deliver speeches. He did not cultivate a public persona. He did not seek loyalty through charisma. He sought compliance through fear and documentation. He rarely wore his SS uniform outside official settings and preferred civilian attire, reinforcing his identity as a policeman rather than a revolutionary. This self-conception mattered. Müller did not see himself as a monster. He saw himself as a functionary doing a necessary job. That mentality would shape his end, or lack thereof. The last confirmed sighting of Heinrich Müller occurred on May 1, 1945. Inside the Führer bunker in Berlin, Adolf Hitler was already dead. Eva Braun lay beside him. The Nazi leadership was in collapse as Soviet forces of the First Belarusian Front closed in, block by block, reducing the city to rubble. Inside the bunker, officials debated escape routes, suicide, and surrender. Some fled, some poisoned themselves, some burned documents and waited. Müller did neither publicly nor conspicuously. Witnesses recalled seeing him calm, even defiant. He reportedly stated that he had no intention of falling into Soviet hands. Then, at some point during the final hours of the regime, he vanished. No one saw him leave. No one recorded his death. He simply ceased to exist within the collapsing administrative structure he had once commanded. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Allied intelligence assumed Müller had died in Berlin. The city was littered with bodies, many unidentifiable. Some forces buried thousands in mass graves. In 1947, reports surfaced that Müller had been buried in the Jewish cemetery Grosse Hamburg Strasse, an irony so sharp it seemed almost symbolic. Subsequent exhumations, however, disproved the claim. The remains were not his. Other burial theories collapsed under forensic scrutiny. No grave could be authenticated. No dental records matched. The body was missing. As years passed, certainty gave way to pursuit. Western intelligence agencies, including the CIA, treated Müller as a fugitive of the highest priority. His intimate knowledge of Nazi intelligence networks, resistance penetrations, and Soviet espionage operations made him uniquely valuable. Some analysts suspected that Müller had defected to the Soviet Union, exchanging his expertise for protection. This theory was bolstered by reports that Müller admired the efficiency of Stalinist security services and had prior involvement in dismantling the Red Orchestra, the Soviet spy network operating in Germany. The logic was uncomfortable but plausible. The man who perfected political policing might have found a home in another totalitarian system. Others believe Müller escaped to South America, following the same clandestine rat lines used by Adolf Eichmann, Joseph Mengele, and Klaus Barbie. Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil were fertile ground for such speculation. Catholic networks, sympathetic officials, and false identities have enabled many high-ranking Nazis to disappear. Yet, unlike Eichmann, Müller left no trail of sightings that could be corroborated. No photographs, no credible eyewitness accounts. His absence was cleaner than most. A more disturbing hypothesis suggests that Müller never fled at all. He was absorbed quietly into the post-war intelligence ecosystem. Some researchers have alleged that U.S. counterintelligence corps officers shielded Müller in exchange for cooperation against the Soviet Union. During the early Cold War, moral compromises were routine. Former Nazis were recruited, laundered, and rebranded as assets. The idea that the Gestapo chief could have been hidden in plain sight, protected by the very powers that later prosecuted lesser figures, remains one of the most unsettling possibilities. None of these theories has been proven. Each rests on circumstantial evidence, intercepted rumors, or retrospective inference. The Soviet archives, partially opened after the Cold War, yielded no definitive confirmation of Müller's presence. Declassified CIA files acknowledge the search but offer no resolution. Mossad, which later captured Eichmann in 1960, pursued Müller intermittently but never closed the case. What distinguishes Müller's disappearance from those of other Nazis is not just its success, but its consistency with his character. Heinrich Müller spent his career mastering what might be called organizational invisibility. He worked through systems rather than symbols. He delegated brutality while retaining oversight. He ensured that responsibility was diffused across departments and signatures. When crimes were discovered, they led nowhere specific, only deeper into the bureaucracy. The system itself became the perpetrator. In this sense, Müller's vanishing is not an anomaly, it's an extension of his method. The man who organized the erasure of identities, the reduction of human beings to transport lists and statistical summaries, ultimately subjected himself to the same process. No witnesses, no documentation, no closure. He dissolved into the administrative void he once controlled. The moral weight of this absence is immense. History relies on bodies, documents, and verdicts. Justice requires presence. Müller denied the world all three. Unlike Himmler, who swallowed poison, or Göring, who escaped the gallows through suicide, Müller left no ending to interrogate. There is no trial transcript, no final confession, no execution photograph. Only speculation and silence. For Holocaust survivors and historians alike, this silence is not neutral. It's corrosive. Müller was not a peripheral actor. He was central to the functioning of genocidal policy. His escape from accountability represents not just a failure of intelligence, but a fracture in the moral narrative of post-war justice. In the end, Heinrich Müller remains exactly what he always was, a man without a face, a function without a footprint. Whether he died anonymously in Berlin, lived out his days under an assumed name, or served another regime in the shadows, the result is the same. The architect of administrative annihilation succeeded in making himself administratively invisible. There is no grave to visit, no date of death to mark, only a name that persists without an ending, hovering at the edge of history like an unresolved file stamped missing. The Amber Room, the dissolution of a monument. The Amber Room stands apart from the innumerable losses of the Second World War because it was never merely an object, it was an environment, a total work of art designed to overwhelm the senses and dissolve the boundary between architecture and ornament. Its disappearance represents not just the theft of valuables, but the erasure of a cultural experience that could not be replicated, only approximated. In a war defined by annihilism, the Amber Room became its most eloquent absence. Originally commissioned in the early 18th century, the room was conceived in Prussia as a display of royal power expressed through material excess. In 1716, it was gifted by King Frederick William I of Prussia to Tsar Peter the Great, a diplomatic gesture meant to cement an alliance and signal cultural parity between emerging empires. Installed eventually in the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo near St. Petersburg, the room evolved over decades into something unparalleled. Its walls were sheathed in amber panels carved and polished into glowing mosaics, framed with gold leaf and punctuated by mirrors that multiplied light endlessly across the surface. In total, more than 6 tons of amber were used, transformed from fossilized resin into a radiant architectural skin. By the 20th century, the Amber Room had acquired a near-mythic status. Often called the eighth wonder of the world, it was valued not only in its material worth, estimated today at over $500 million, but for its symbolic resonance. It embodied continuity, craftsmanship, and the idea that culture could outlast the political systems that produced it. That illusion would not survive the war. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, Army Group North advanced rapidly toward Leningrad, cutting through the Baltic region with devastating speed. Soviet curators at the Catherine Palace attempted to evacuate priceless artifacts ahead of the invasion, but the Amber Room posed a unique problem. Amber, though hardened, is fragile. The panels have been integrated into the walls, could not be removed quickly without crumbling. Conservators attempted to disguise the room by covering it with wallpaper, a gesture born more of desperation than optimism. The deception failed. German art specialists accompanying the Wehrmacht recognized the room almost immediately. What followed was an operation executed with chilling efficiency. In just 36 hours, German personnel dismantled the Amber Room panel by panel. carefully crating its components for transport. What generations had assembled over decades was undone in a day and a half. The crates were sent west to Königsberg, the historic Prussian capital, where the Amber Room was installed inside Königsberg Castle as both a trophy and a symbol of cultural reclamation. From 1941 to 1944, the room was placed on public display. German officials presented it as evidence of rightful restitution, arguing that Prussia was merely reclaiming what had once been its own. Visitors walked through the glowing chambers as the war outside turned increasingly catastrophic. Even as the Eastern Front consumed millions of lives, the Amber Room survived intact, luminous, and eerily untouched by the surrounding destruction. By late 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Allied bombing campaigns intensified, and Königsberg became a target. In August of that year, the Royal Air Force launched a devastating firebombing raid that engulfed much of the city, including the castle. Flames tore through its upper structures, collapsing roofs and gutting interior spaces. In anticipation of such an attack, German authorities had already dismantled the Amber Room once again, sealing its panels into crates and moving them deep into the castle's lower levels. This is where the record fractures. When Soviet forces captured Königsberg in April 1945 after brutal urban combat, they found the castle in ruins. Fires had burned uncontrolled for days. Entire sections had collapsed into basements and vaults. Soviet trophy commissions, tasked with recovering looted cultural property, searched systematically. They found paintings, furniture, books, and fragments of architectural ornament. They did not find the Amber Room. No inventory confirmed its destruction. No crate bearing its contents was identified. The panels were not located among the ruins, nor cataloged among recovered items shipped back to the Soviet Union. They were simply gone. What had been removed with bureaucratic precision vanished without a trace. In the decades that followed, the search for the Amber Room became one of the most exhaustive and obsessive treasure hunts in modern history. Soviet investigators initially favored the theory that the room had been destroyed in the 1944 bombing or subsequent fires. Amber is combustible. Exposed to high heat, it can burn or disintegrate. Yet this explanation never fully satisfied researchers. No melted residue consistent with 6 tons of amber were documented in the castle ruins. Moreover, the panels had been crated and stored below ground, where some areas survived relatively intact. Alternative theories multiplied. One suggested that the crates were evacuated from Königsberg in the final months of the war and loaded onto a ship fleeing west with refugees and valuables. The most frequently cited candidate was the Wilhelm Gustloff, a former cruise ship sunk by a Soviet submarine in January 1945, killing over 9,000 people. If the Amber Room had been aboard, it would now rest at the bottom of the Baltic Sea. Yet shipping manifests recovered from the wreck contained no definitive reference to the room, and the timeline remained speculative. Another theory placed the Amber Room in the subterranean world of Nazi Germany's emergency infrastructure. According to this hypothesis, the crates were transported to secret tunnels or abandoned mines, particularly in the Aal Mountains of Lower Silesia, where the Nazis concealed weapons, archives, and stolen art. Numerous expeditions have probed these sites using ground-penetrating radar and archival maps. None have produced conclusive evidence. The mystery acquired new texture in 1997 when a breakthrough occurred far from Königsberg. German authorities recovered an original mosaic panel from the Amber Room, titled Feel and Touch, along with a chest of drawers from the family of a former German soldier. The discovery confirmed what many had long suspected. At least fragments of the room were looted privately amid the chaos of collapse. The panel was returned to Russia, where it became a haunting proof of authenticity and loss. The Amber Room had not simply vanished as a single event, it had fractured. By that point, Russia had already embarked on an ambitious project to reconstruct the room. Using archival photographs, surviving documentation, and traditional amber working techniques, artisans spent decades recreating the panels at the Catherine Palace. In 2003, the reconstructed Amber Room was unveiled, a triumph of patience and craftsmanship. Visitors once again stood inside the walls of fire-colored light, surrounded by mirrors and gold. Yet the reconstruction, for all its beauty, underscored the absence it sought to remedy. The original Amber Room was not merely a visual arrangement. It was a historical object that absorbed centuries of touch, alteration, and presence. Its disappearance cannot be undone by replication. The copy is testimony to loss, not its resolution. The Amber Room endures as a symbol of the Second World War's totalizing destruction, not only of lives and cities, but of memory itself. Unlike buildings reduced to rubble or artifacts shattered by bombs, the room was methodically removed, preserved, hidden, and then erased from record. Its fate mirrors the broader violence of the war, in which systems of order and care were repurposed towards obliteration. Whether the Amber Room burned, sank, or still waits in darkness beneath stone and soil remains unresolved. What is certain is that its disappearance occupies a unique moral space. It reminds us that war does not only kill the present, it reaches backward, severing ties to the past, and forward, denying future generations the right to encounter what once existed. The Amber Room is gone, not because it was fragile, but because the world around it became indifferent to preservation. In that sense, its loss is not an anomaly. It is the rule, rendered visible in gold, amber, and silence. The Nanking 3000, the vanished battalion. Among the more enigmatic wartime disappearances is the account of a Chinese nationalist battalion reportedly vanishing near Nanking in late 1939, a story that occupies the intersection of historical chaos and legend. According to contemporary accounts, nearly 3,000 soldiers had been stationed along a defensive line guarding a strategically vital bridge, part of an effort to slow the relentless advance of the Imperial Japanese Army. The battalion's commander, confident that his men held their position, retired for the night, only to awaken to a scene of complete absence. No soldiers, no skirmishes, no footprints, and no sign of struggle. In some retellings, the entire line simply evaporated, leaving behind only silence. The starkness of the narrative, a mass disappearance without trace, naturally fueled fascination in anomalous literature and wartime lore. How could 3,000 trained soldiers disappear in the dead of night without leaving evidence? Yet when examined against the broader historical context of the Second Sino-Japanese War, the tale may be less supernatural than it first appears, though no less tragic in its implications. The period was defined by extreme dislocation. An estimated 60 million Chinese civilians were in flight from advancing armies. Villages and towns were razed, and local military discipline often dissolved in the face of overwhelming violence. Chaos, attrition, and mass flight were the norm. Any single battalion could easily be fragmented, absorbed, or scattered in the confusion of movement and retreat. Some historians suggest that the vanishing may be a compressed narrative, a symbolic recollection of the trauma surrounding the Nanking Massacre of 1937, when Japanese forces systematically killed roughly 300,000 civilians and prisoners of war. In this light, the story of the missing battalion functions less as a factual report than as a metaphor for their total erasure of identity amid wartime atrocities. Individuals and units alike could be physically destroyed, dispersed, or subsumed into the demographic void created by violence and flight. Whether these soldiers literally disappeared overnight, or whether they were absorbed in the chaos of mass casualties and displacements, the story endures because it captures a deeper truth of the Pacific theater. Under the relentless pressure of modern warfare, the line between existence and erasure could vanish in an instant. The disappearance also reflects the psychological weight of the era. In a landscape of relentless advance, fear, and systemic violence, the loss of a battalion was more than a tactical setback. It was an existential rupture. Soldiers were not merely personnel. They were symbols of resistance, cohesion, and order. To see an entire line of defense vanish, whether by desertion, annihilation, or absorption into mass flight, was to confront the fragility of human presence itself. Stories like the Nanking Battalion, therefore, resonate not because they are necessarily supernatural, but because they crystallize the sense of total dislocation and moral collapse that characterized the war. In the end, the legend of the Nanking soldiers persists as a testament to the scale of loss during the Second Sino-Japanese War. It illustrates how wartime trauma can be distilled into a narrative of vanishing, a symbolic echo of broader destruction. Like so many disappearances of the era, whether factual, exaggerated, or mythologized, it forces reflection on the human cost of conflict, the precariousness of identity in wartime, and the ways in which memory preserves absence as powerfully as presence. You've heard about the 23 petrified soldiers on Joe Rogan.
Well, you know that there's a famous story from the Soviet Union that these guys shot at a UFO and it turned them into stone.
But no one ever mentioned the 17 British soldiers list. The 17 British soldiers of Auschwitz, the clandestine list. In 2009, a discovery at the Auschwitz-Birkenau complex challenged historians' understanding of one of the most meticulously documented sites of the Holocaust. During routine archaeological excavations, researchers unearthed a small, unassuming document that contained the names of 17 British soldiers. The list, hidden in a location clearly not intended for discovery by the SS, did not appear in any existing prisoner records or POW rosters. This seemingly minor find immediately raised profound questions about identity, allegiance, and the layers of secrecy within the machinery of genocide. The presence of British nationalists at Auschwitz, a site designed almost exclusively for the extermination of Jews, Romani people, Poles, and other targeted groups, has puzzled scholars. The list annotations include sporadic German words, such as never and now, further complicating interpretation. Some researchers hypothesize that the men may have been affiliated with the British Free Corps, a small SS unit formed of British volunteers who defected to fight alongside Germany against the Soviet Union. Yet the evidence remains circumstantial, and the document offers no explanatory context. The discovery has been framed as a micro-disappearance within the broader narrative of the Holocaust. The identities of these 17 men, their fates, motives, and actions remain unknown. Were they coerced captives, collaborators, or victims of circumstance? The lack of corroborating records leaves their story suspended in uncertainty, a fragment of history resistant to closure. The document's hidden placement suggests deliberate obfuscation, a layer of clandestiny added even within the already opaque structures of Auschwitz administration. It reminds us that even in the most intensively studied sites of atrocity, historical blind spots persist. The discovery illuminates the ways in which history can preserve absence as powerfully as presence, a record of names whose lives cannot be fully traced, an enigma embedded in the epic machinery of murder. In the end, the Auschwitz list is less a straightforward historical record than a haunting symbol. It gestures towards the unrecorded, the obscured, and the vanished, those who slip through the cracks of documentation, even amidst the world's most scrutinized human catastrophe. The 17 British soldiers remain ghosts on paper, their identities a reminder that even in the era of exhaustive record-keeping, some disappearances endure, resisting resolution and defying interpretation. USS Capelin, SS-289, the eternal patrol of the Molucca Sea. The USS Capelin, a Belau-class submarine, remains one of the many haunting lost boats of World War II, a vessel whose final fate is shrouded in uncertainty and whose crew was claimed by the sea without a trace. Launched into the Pacific theater during the height of the submarine campaign, Capelin had already distinguished herself by sinking a Japanese cargo vessel in November 1943. Following that engagement, she departed from Darwin, Australia, under orders to patrol the busy trade routes near the Sanji Islands and Davao Gulf, key arteries for Japanese logistics. The final verified contact with Capelin occurred on December 2, 1943, when the submarine USS Bonefish detected a friendly vessel in its operational area. The two submarines exchanged sonar signals, and Capelin acknowledged Bonefish's presence. After this brief interaction, she vanished. Radio silence continued until December 9th, when the Navy, growing increasingly anxious, attempted to establish contact with the boat. No response came. The silence was absolute, leaving the Capelin, her 76 officers and men, and her mission suspended in an unresolved void. Post-war investigations attempted to reconstruct what might have occurred, considering both enemy action and operational hazards. Japanese records indicate the presence of minefields and suggest the mine layer Wakataka may have launched depth charges in the general area of Capelin's patrol. Yet the timing of these attacks does not perfectly align with the last Bonefish sighting, leaving the true cause speculative. Some historians have proposed the disappearance resulted from an operational accident, a mechanical failure, a compromised hatch, or an unexpected pressure hull rupture. In the extreme environment of submarine warfare, a single malfunction could produce instantaneous catastrophe, leaving no survivors and no chance to report distress. The USS Capelin exemplifies the perilous reality of the silent service, where survival depended on the integrity of a few critical systems and on the smallest procedural details. Each patrol involved navigating minefields, avoiding anti-submarine craft, and maintaining stealth while under constant psychological strain. For Capelin, whatever event occurred on that December night was decisive and fatal, consigning the submarine and her crew to what the Navy termed the Eternal Patrol, a term reserved for boats lost with all hands and no wreck ever recovered. Despite advances in underwater exploration and decades of investigation, Capelin's wreck has never been located. Her loss remains a stark reminder of the ocean's ability to race even highly trained crews and well-documented operations. In the annals of Navy history, she joins the ranks of submarines that disappeared silently, leaving only fragments of records, post-war conjecture, and the enduring memory of 76 men whose lives ended far from the sight of their comrades, their fate known only to the deep. The empty P-40 Warhawk, the ghost of Pearl Harbor. Among the many eerie tales of the Pacific theater, few endure like the story of the so-called ghost plane that appeared on U.S. radar on December 8, 1942, exactly 1 year and a day after the attack on Pearl Harbor. Radar operators detected an unidentified aircraft approaching the Hawaiian Islands from the direction of Japan. Given the heightened alert status and the fresh memory of the devastation at Pearl Harbor, 2 fighter pilots were scrambled to intercept the intruder. According to reports from the interceptors, they encountered a P-40 Warhawk, its airframe riddled with bullet holes and missing landing gear, yet still seemingly under control. As they closed in, the pilots claimed to see a figure slumped in the cockpit, covered in blood, who briefly waved before the aircraft lost altitude and plummeted to the ground. When recovery teams arrived at the crash site, they found the plane empty, no pilot, no body. The aircraft was later identified as one that had been reported lost during the Pearl Harbor attack, linking it symbolically to the earlier tragedy. While modern historians classify this incident as an urban legend, the story reveals more than a potential factual inaccuracy. It captures the psychological atmosphere of the Pacific War. Radar operators, pilots, and ground crews were living under constant anxiety, haunted by the memory of surprise attacks and by the countless young men who vanished without a trace. The ghost plane functions as a metaphorical extension of those losses, a vessel that appears, seemingly animated, only to disappear again, leaving witnesses and history grappling with absence. In this sense, the tale of the ghost P-40 is less about verifying aerial anomalies and more about understanding the emotional landscape of wartime America. It embodies the collective grief, the tension, and the imagination of a military and civilian population confronting the reality that thousands of servicemen in the Pacific never returned, often leaving only shadows behind. Even as a myth, the story persists, a spectral echo of the disappearances that define the theater and a cultural reflection of the anxieties of war.